My name is Sarah. I'm 32 years old. 3 months ago, I walked into what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, only to discover that my fiancé had been living a double life that would shatter everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and family. The wedding venue was decorated exactly as we had planned together for 2 years. The flowers were perfect, the guests were seated, and I was standing in my dream dress when I overheard a conversation that changed everything. My maid of honor was on the phone in the bridal suite, and what she said next would turn my fairy tale into a nightmare. If you've ever felt betrayed by the people closest to you, drop a comment about where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button, because this story will show you exactly how I turned the tables on everyone who thought they could destroy me. Before I tell you what happened that day, let me paint you a picture of how perfect my life seemed just hours before it all came crashing down. I had been with Marcus for 4 years. We met at a corporate networking event where I was representing my marketing firm and he was there for his real estate company. The attraction was instant, the kind of chemistry that makes you believe in soulmates. Marcus was everything I thought I wanted. Tall, successful, charming in that effortless way that made everyone in the room gravitate toward him. He had this confidence that I found he could walk into any irresistible, the way situation, and immediately become the center of attention. Our relationship moved fast, maybe too fast in hindsight. Within 6 months, we were practically living together. Within a year, we were talking about marriage, children, the house we would buy in the suburbs. Marcus had this way of making everything feel urgent and exciting, like we were on this incredible adventure together that couldn't day. Looking back, I realized that wait, another NC should have been my first red flag. But when you're swept up in what feels like the love story of a lifetime, you don't question the P happened exactly 18 months into our relationship. Marcus took acing the proposal me to the same restaurant where we had our first official date, got down on one knee in front of the entire dining room, and presented me with a ring that was soldiers were crying. And I felt like the stunning, it took my breath away. Everyone applauded, stranuckiest woman alive. The ring was a 2-carat princess, cut diamond with smaller diamonds around the band, exactly what I had pointed out in a magazine months earlier during one of those casual conversations about future plans. Planning our wedding became my second full-time job. I threw myself into every detail with the kind of obsessive dedication that probably should have concerned me. Color schemes, floral arrangements, menu taste, I created spreadsheets for everything, timelinings, venue visits, dress fittings, documents that broke down every minute of our special day. Marcus seemed happy to let me handle most of the planning, saying wanted whatever would make me happy. He trusted my taste completely, and just back approach was sweet. A time, I thought his lie to let me have the wedding of my dreams. My sign that he was secure enough in himself maid of honor was Jessica, my best friend since college, and the person I trusted more than anyone else in the world. Jessica changed, every family drama. She was the one who talked me through my doubts when Marcus had been there through every relationship, every career, and I hit rough patches, always reminding me that no relationship is perfect, and that she had was special out my dress, organized me pick my bachelorette party, and spent countless hours listening to me bored her to tears. Jessica S. over wedding details that probably was more than a friend. She was the sister I never had, the person I called. The morning of the wedding, I woke up when I needed honest advice or just someone to listen of planning. The day was feeling like I was floating. After 2 years, finally here. I had stayed at my parents' house the night before, following the tradition of not seeing my favorite breakfast, my room before the ceremony. My mother-made father kept tearing up every time he looked at me, and I felt surrounded by love and support. The hair and makeup team arrived right on schedule, transforming our salon. Everything was going exactly family living room into a professional according to plan. By noon, we had moved to the bridal suite at the venue, a beautiful room overlooking the gardens where the ceremony would take place in just 4 hours. My bridesmaids were getting ready, champagne was flowing, and the photographer was capturing every moment of what was supposed to be purimmed about for months, thinking that joy. I remember looking at myself in the full-length mirror, wearing the dress I had dreamed more certain about anything in my life. Jessica, I had never felt more beautiful or had stepped out to take a phone call. Something she said was work-related but couldn't wait. I didn't think anything of it at first. Jessica was always fielding calls from her job in pharmaceutical sales, and I knew to close a big deal that she had been trying weak. But something about her tone when she walked out of the room felt different, more secretive than professional. I was the slightly open door of the odd job next would replay in my mind for months, getting my final touch-ups done when I heard her voice through dining room. What I hear the walls were thin and in hushed tones, but afterward. Jessica was speaking enough that I could make out every word. She was standing close to someone about timing. She was that something might go wrong. At first, I thought she was talking about the wedding logistics, about making sure everything went smoothly, about how nervous she said something that made my blood run cold. The caterers. But then, maybe coordinating with the wedding planner, or she said Marcus's name, followed by words that didn't make sense in the context of my wedding day. She was talking about protecting him, about making sure I didn't find out until it was too late to do anything about it. She mentioned timing again, the time I discovered the truth. It would be too complicated, how they had calculated everything perfectly so that I'd to back out. The way she was speaking, with this cold calculation in her voice, was completely different from the warm, supportive friend who had been helping me get ready just minutes of a puzzle earlier. I stood frozen, still in my wedding dress, as pieces didn't even know existed began falling into place. The photographer was still snapping pictures. My other bridesmaids were laughing and chatting, completely oblivious to what I was hearing. But I couldn't move, couldn't process what Jessica was actually saying. The words felt like they were coming through water, distorted and impossible to fully comprehend. Then Jessica said something that shattered my world, completely had never heard of before, and talk. She mentioned another woman's name, someone odd, about how difficult it had been to keep Marcus focused on going through with the wedding when he clearly wanted to be with this other person instead. She talked about financial, it was that the arrangements, about how important ceremony happened before certain legal documents could be processed. She used words like inheritance, trust fund, and beneficiary in ways that suggested my wedding wasn't about love at all. The woman I had trustiest secrets, the person I had chosen with my deep to stand beside me on the most important day of my life, was orchestrating some kind of elaborate deception that involved my fiancé and a woman whose existence I had been completely unaware of until dress surround that moment. As I stood there in my whited by flowers and champagne and alpines of a fairy, the tiara I thought I knew about my tail wedding, I realized that everything life was built on lies. I pressed myself against the wall, my heart hammering so hard I was certain everyone could hear it through the thin fabric of my wedding dress. Jessica's voice continued through the door, each word hitting me like a physical blow. She was explaining to whoever was on the other end of that phone call how they had managed to keep me distracted during the final weeks of planning, how Marcus had been spending his evenings with this other woman while I was obsessing over centerpiece arrangements and seating charts. The level of coordination required for what I was hearing was staggering. This of weakness. This was a calculated, wasn't a spontaneous affair or a moment long-term deception that involved multiple people working together to manipulate me. Jessica mentioned meeting times, cover stories they had crafted, and specific lies they had told me to keep me from discovering the truth. She talked about how they had carefully managed Marcus's schedule, making sure his absences coincided with my busiest planning periods so I wouldn't notice how often he was unavailable. What made it even more devastating was hearing Jessica laugh as she recounted some of their close calls. She described moments when I had almost caught them, Times when I had asked innocent questions that had required quick thinking and creative explanations. She was laughing about how trusting I was, how easy it had been to redirect my attention whenever I got too curious about Marcus's whereabouts, or his mysterious phone calls that he always took in private. The other woman's name was Victoria. And from what Jessica was saying, she wasn't just some casual had been togetherling. They, for over a year, conducting their relationship in hotel rooms and at her apartment, I while was at home planning our future. Victoria apparently knew all about me, about the wedding, about the elaborate raid that unfolding. She was even supposed to be at the ceremony today, sitting in the audience like any other guest, watching the man she was sleeping with marry someone else for reasons that had nothing to do with love. As the conversation continued, the financial motivations became clearer. Marcus stood to inherit a substantial trust fund from his grandmother, but fifth birthday, which was next only if he was married by his 30, believing that marriage was a sign of stability month. His grandmother had always been traditional was that her grandson was, and maturity. What she did, using her conditions to trap an innocent woman in relationship in secret. The plan, a fraudulent marriage while continuing his real, as Jessica laid it out, was for secure his inheritance. And then gradually, Marcus to go through with the ceremony, create problems in our marriage a year or two. By that would lead to what would appear to be a natural divorce within then, the trust fund would be his permanently, and he would be free to be with Victoria openly. They had calculated that a divorce settlement would cost him far less than losing the inheritance entirely. And I would be left with nothing but the wreckage of what I thought had been a real marriage. Jessica's role in all of this was to keep me emotionally stable and focused on the wedding preparations, making sure I didn't start asking difficult questions or developing doubts that might lead me to discover the truth prematurely. She had been reporting back to Marcus about my moods, my concerns, even my private conversations with her about our every vulnerable confession I had made to my relationship, every moment of trust eyeing me. The photographer man, who was Dee's best friend, had been shared with the called my name from across the room. Wanting to get more, we headed to the ceremony. I somehow shots of me in the dress before it crumbled around me. The other bridesmaids were checking, managed to respond normally, smiling and posing while my whirling excitedly about how their makeup and gathering their bouquets, chat beautiful everything looked, how perfect the day was turning out to be. They had no idea that the bride they were celebrating was about to become the victim of an elaborate con game. Jessica ended the biggest smile, phone call, and walked back into the room with hing about how stunning immediately Gus I looked, and how Marcus was going to cry down the aisle. The when he saw me walking performance was flawless. Her voice was warm, her excitement seemed genuine, and she and veil with the same yust over my dress. Attention to detail she had shown throughout the entire planning process. If suspect I hadn't overheard that conversation, I would never of her mouth was carefully that every word out calculated manipulation. My mind was racing, trying to process the magnitude of what I had learned, how many other people knew, Jessica and Victoria, or was this elaborate deception limited to Marcus? There are others involved. I thought about Marcus's groomsmen, his family members who had welcomed me sought our engagement party. How many of partners who had attended warmly his business in on the joke. How many people had been watching me plan this wedding, knowing it was nothing but an expensive theater production designed to defraud an inheritance? The worst part wasn't even the betrayal itself, though that was devastating enough. The worst part was realizing how thoroughly I had been studied and manipulated. Every conversation, every shared moment, every intimate detail of our relationship had been performance art. Marcus knew exactly what to say to keep me happy, exactly how to behave to maintain my trust, exactly which gestures and gifts was real. He would convince me that our love had learned my curiosities, my dreams patterns, my ins, and he had used all of that information to create a perfect illusion. I had practiced myself wondering how many other women Marcus kissed on before settling on me as his target. Was I chosen specifically because of my trusting nature, my tendency to throw myself completely into relationships, my obvious desire for marriage and family? Had they researched me before Marcus approached me at that networking event? Or had he simply gotten lucky in finding someone so perfectly suited to be manipulated? The timeline made it have been obvious before sense now in ways that show. Marcus's sudden urgency about getting married, his insistence on a specific date that seemed romantic at the time, but now clearly corresponded to his birthday deadline. His generous budget for the wedding, which I had attributed to his success, but now realized was probably calculated as a necessary business expense for securing his inheritance. His willingness to let me handle all the planning, which I had seen as trust, but now understood as disinterest in an event that meant nothing to him beyond its legal implications. Jessica appeared beside me with my bouquet, a stunning arrangement of white roses and peonies that had cost more than most people spend on flowers for their entire home. She was straightening my veil, making sure every detail was perfect, playing her role as the devoted best friend right up until the moment I would walk down that aisle and legally bind myself to a man who saw me as nothing more than a business transaction. I looked at Jessica arranging my veil with such tender care, and something inside me shifted. The shock was giving way to something else, something colder and more calculating. I had two choices in that moment. I could confront them all right there, create a scene that would give them exactly what they expected from the emotional, trusting woman they had been manipulating for months. Or I could play a different game entirely. The woman they thought they knew would have collapsed in tears, would have screamed and thrown things and demanded explanations that would only lead to more lies. But standing there in that bridal suite, surrounded by the evidence of their elaborate deception, I realized they had made one critical mistake. They had underestimated me completely. I smiled at Jessica, the same warm smile I had been giving her for 10 years of friendship, and told her how grateful I was to have her by my side on such an important day. I watched her face light up with what appeared to be genuine affection, and I marveled at how convincing she was. If I hadn't heard that phone conversation, I completely in her loyalty would still believed Lovin. My mind was working differently now, processing information with a clarity I had never experienced before. I started thinking like the marketing strategist I was at work, analyzing the situationnesses and opportunities. Marcus from every angle looking for weak, and Jessica and this Victoria woman thought they had crafted the perfect plan, but they had made several assumptions against them. First, that were about to work. They assumed I would remain ignorant until after the ceremony was complete. Second, they assumed I would react emotionally rather than strategically if I did discover the truth. Third, and most importantly, they assumed I was powerless to do anything about it even if I found out. They were about to learn how wrong they were on all three counts. I excused myself to the bathroom, claiming I needed a moment to compose myself before the ceremony. Instead, I pulled out my phone and started making calls. The first was to my lawyer Chen, Davi, who had handled the legal aspects of some business contracts for my marketing firm. I hate personal number because we had developed a friendship over the years, and I knew even he would answer on a Saturday afternoon. When David picked up, I kept my voice calm and professional, explaining that I needed immediate legal advice about a situation involving fraud and inheritance manipulation. I gave him the basic details of what I had overheard, and I could hear his sharp intake of breath as he realized the implications. David confirmed what I suspected, that if Marcus was false pretenses, specifically entering into marriage to defraud a trust fund, there importantly, David explained were serious legal consequences that could include criminal charges. Moored that if I could prove the fraudulent intent before the ceremony was completed, I could potentially use information that to protect myself and possibly help Marcus's grandmother understand what was really happening to her money. He advised me to document everything I could, to try to get evidence of their communications, and to consider whether there was a way to expose the truth that would serve justice rather than just revenge. My second call was to someone I never thought I would need on my wedding day. My cousin Rachel worked as a private investigator in the city, specializing in corporate fraud cases. Rachel and I had grown apart over the years, but family loyalty runs deep, and I knew she would help me if I asked. When I explained the situation, immediately focused, Rachel became and professional. She told her preliminaried me, Shiku on Victoria background information within an hour, and that she could potentially arrange for documentation of any communications between Marcus, Jessica, and Victoria if I could give her their basic phone numbers and information. Rachel also suggested something that made my pulse quicken with possibility. If they were planning to continue their deception through the ceremony, there might be ways to gather evidence during the wedding itself that would be legally admissible. Later made was the most difficult. The third call, but also the most necessary. I called Marcus's grandmother, Eleanor, a sharp-witted woman in her 80s who had always treated me with warmth and respect during family gatherings. Eleanor was old-fashioned in many ways, but she was nobody's fool, and she had built the family fortune through decades of smart business decisions. When Eleanor answered, I took a deep breath and made a choice needed to speak with her that would change everything. I told her privately about Marcus before the ceremony, that I had discovered something that affected her trust fund arrangement. Eleanor's voice immediately became alert and focused. She had not built a multi-million-dollar business venue within the hour, bringing interests. Eleanor agreed to meet me at her own lawyer empire by ignoring potential threats to her financial me that if with her, she assured Marcus was indeed triangulate her trust fund requirements to manip through a fraudulent marriage, she would take swift and steel in her voice, reminded me why decisive action. Fed by his grandmother, Marcus had always been slightly intimidate stature and gentle demeanor. Despite her petite, the balance of power had shifted completely. Marcus finished these calls. I realized that they were manipulating Jessica, and Victoria, thought naive, trusting woman who would discover their betrayal too late to do anything about it. Instead, they were about to face how their minds worked. Who understood their someone who had spent 4 years learning exactly had professional legal help and family support, weaknesses and blind spots, and who now a composure that surprised even me. Jessica. I walked back into the bridal suite with commenting on how calm immediately noticed the change in my demeanor, and radiant I looked. She attributed it to pre-ceremony nerves settling into excitement, never suspecting that I had just spent the last 20 dismantle their carefully constructed lies. The minutes assembling a team to photographer wanted to take more pictures, and I posed with genuine smiles now, knowing that these no longer the victim in this story. Photos would document not my last moments of innocence, but my first moments of empowerment. I was people who had underestimated me, so I was about to become something much more dangerous to completely. Jessica kept checking her phone, probably coordinating with Marcus and Victoria about final text or take a quick call. I felt more timing details. Each time she stepped away too certain that I was making the right choice. These people had invested months of effort into deceiving me, but they had made one fatal error. They had taught me exactly how betrayal works. And now, I was about to use that education against them. My other bridesmaids were growing more excited as the ceremony time approached. Chattering and I were together. Their genuine enthusiasm was both about how romantic everything was and how perfect Marcus fed to know the truth about what they were. Women, my real friends, Desser, heartbreaking and motivating. These participating in. More importantly, they deserve to seal quietly. That women don't have to accept, betray relationships. The one who avoides keeper in my had always been the best in everyone to seed confrontation and tried. But standing there in my wedding dress, surrounded by flowers, pa money intended for wed to secure a fraudulent inheritance, I discover of myself I had never met before. This diversion where I had been emotional version was strategic, been trusting, calculateless where I had been a commo, and absolutely Ruth dating. The ceremony was scheduled to begin in less than 2 hours. Marcus was probably getting ready with his groomsmen, putting on the performance of the nervous but sit in the audience and watch the groom. Victoria was presumably preparing to she loved marry another woman for money. Jessica was continuing her role as the supportive best friend, never suspecting that her phone conversation had been overheard. But Eleanor was on her way. With her lawyer, Rachel was gathering evidence, and David was preparing legal documents that would protect me from whatever financial arrangements Marcus, they thought they were controlling, had made without my knowledge. The wedding, entirely different, was about to become something I looked at myself in the mirror, one final time, loved completely. The woman looking as the woman who had trusted blindly and back at me now, understood that sometimes the greatest act of self-love is refusing to let others treat to plan and execute a longable. Marcus had taught me how as disposed term strategy through his own deception. Now I was going to show him exactly how well I had learned the lesson. Eleanor arrived at the venue exactly when she said she would, accompanied by a distinguished gentleman in his 70s who introduced himself as Thomas Whitmore, her personal attorney for the past 30 years. They met me in a small conference room that the venue coordinator had arranged, away from the main bridal area where my wedding party was still preparing. Eleanor looked elegant in a navy blue suit with pearls, but her expression was steel beneath the refined exterior. Thomas had brought a briefcase full of documents related to the trust fund arrangement, and as he spread them across the conference table, I began to understand the true scope of what Marcus was attempting. The inheritance wasn't just substantial. It was generational wealth that would set him up for life. Eleanor had structured it specifically to encourage marriage and family stability, believing that settled men made better stewards of family resources. The conditions were very specific. Marcus had to be legally married before his 35th birthday, which was exactly 3 weeks away. The marriage had to last a minimum of 2 years before any of the principal could be accessed, though he would receive substantial monthly distributions immediately upon providing proof of marriage. If the marriage failed before the 2-year mark due to infidelity or fraud on his part, he would forfeit everything permanently. Eleanor's eyes flashed with anger as she reviewed the timeline. She had been monitoring Marcus's relationship status carefully, and our sudden engagement followed by this rushed wedding timeline now made perfect sense. She had actually been pleased that he seemed suspecting that her to be maturing and settling down. Never innocent woman. Thomas explained conditions were being used to manipulate and the marriage under false pretenses. Specifically, that if we could prove Marcus was entering to defraud the trust, his benef Eleanor could immediately revitiate status and potentially pursue criminal charges. However, the evidence needed to be substantial and legally admissible. My overheard phone conversation was compelling, but not enough on its own. That was where Rachel's expertise became crucial. She had spent the last hour running background and trace communication checks and using her professional resources to investigate Victoria patterns between the 3 conspirators. What she discovered was even more extensive than I had imagined. This wasn't Marcus's first attempt at manipulating a relationship for financial gain. Rachel had found evidence of at least 2 other Marcus under suspicious circumstances. One had been an older woman over the past 5 years who had been involved with women with significant assets who had mysteriously changed her will in his favor before dying in what was. Another had been a business partner's ruled an accidental fall daughter whose trust fund Marcus had somehow gained access to before their relationship end was clear, abruptly. The pattern and it painted a picture of a man who systematically identified and exploited women for financial gain. Victoria appeared to be his long-term partner in these schemes, playing different roles depending on what each situation required. Sometimes she was the sympathetic friend who helped manipulate the target. Other times, she remained in the background while Marcus conducted his deceptions alone. Thomas was furious as he reviewed Rachel's findings. This level of financial fraud could result in federal charges, and Eleanor's trust fund was just the latest in what appeared to be a series of criminal enterprises. He immediately law enforcement, explaining that we began making calls to contacts and had uncovered what might be an ongoing pattern of inheritance fraud that needed immediate investigation. Meanwhile, Eleanor was making her own plans. She had decided that the best way to expose Marcus with his deception was to let him proceed the moment when it would cause personal consequences. She want him maximum legal and him to commit fully to the fraud, to stand up in front of all our family and friends and make never intended to keep vows, he creating the strongest possible legal case against him. The plan that emerged was both elegant and devastating the ceremony as planned. Eleanor would attend, watching her grandson commit what she now understood was a calculated fraud. Rachel would position herself among the guests with recording equipment, documenting everything for legal purposes. Thomas would have law enforcement standing by, ready to intervene at the optimal moment. My role was the most challenging. I had to continue playing the naive bride, going through with the ceremony until the critical moment when the fraud would be complete but before ended. The timing had to be perfect, because legal documents could be signed or processed once I said my vows and signed the marriage certificate. Marcus would have achieved his immediate goal of securing the inheritance payments. Eleanor suggested that the moment of maximum impact would be during the vow exchange itself. She wanted Marcus to speak his fraudulent promises aloud in front of everyone who mattered to him, creating not just legal evidence, but public humiliation. The woman he had underestimated so completely would reveal his deception in front of his family, his friends, and histolize the details. I felt estranged business associates. That day taught me that betrayal isn't just about being hurt. It's about choosing how you respond when someone shows you who they really are. Marcus lost everything: his inheritance, his freedom, and his carefully constructed facade. Victoria and Jessica faced their own consequences for conspiracy to commit fraud, but I gained something invaluable: the knowledge that I'm stronger than anyone who tries to manipulate me will ever expect. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to be the victim in someone else's story and instead become the author of your own justice. Trust your instincts, protect your worth, and never let anyone convince you that love requires you to sacrifice your dignity.